Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security, engineering, and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Denise Farnsworth, CEO and founder of Inspire Privacy and Security, as well as president of Farnsworth Law. And we'll be talking about Denise's career in privacy working for major corporations like Microsoft and Facebook, but also her area of focus today, data privacy for small and medium-sized businesses. Denise, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I know it took a little bit of effort for us to figure out scheduling and everything, but we were introduced a while back by Robin Andrus, who was actually on episode 5 of the show and is the chief privacy officer at Skyflow. And once you and I started chatting, I was really blown away by your background and experience that you have in the privacy space. So that feels like a good place to start. What's your educational background, work history, and how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, I have a really non-traditional background. I had a family first. I actually have 6 kids. Um, and so I finished my degree as when I was older. I finished it. Actually started it at Brigham Young University. I went to University of Phoenix while I was working to finish it. And then I went to Seattle University Law School and finished it while I was working and raising kids.
Wow. 6 kids. I have 2. I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine a third one.
It gets a little crazy.
Yeah, so you've had an extensive career in privacy, working across major companies with global scale, like Microsoft, NetSuite, Facebook. Through your career, what are some of the major changes that have happened in privacy, both for businesses, consumers, and also as a privacy professional?
Wow. So when I started working with big tech, I started with Apple, and the next big tech company I worked with was Microsoft, and it basically privacy in the U.S. was a subject matter expert area. So I was an issue spotter, and then I would take it to the subject matter expert. They would basically give their legal advice, and then you would balance the risk, and you'd decide whether the return on investment was enough to action the advice that was given. Obviously, that's changed significantly today.
Yeah. So what do you think were the changes in the industry that led to the switch essentially from this balance of like, should we do this? Is it the risk to our business worth it versus like where we are now?
Yeah, I actually was working for Microsoft as the head of legal for Microsoft Ireland when GDPR was passed. And just prior to that, I was the person on the ground for Microsoft that was responsible for getting an amicus brief in the case that was filed against Microsoft, the DOJ warrant case that ended up being the Cloud Act. And those were very, very significant events that occurred that started to really change the conversation. Now, obviously, there were many, many other things that were going on, but from my perspective, those were the biggest ones.
hmm And when GDPR first was, started to become a thing, what was the reaction from your perspective from, privacy professionals as well as businesses at that time?
Oh, wow. I think it was mixed. I think there were a lot of people who thought that the rest of the world could never impact the United States, meaning
hmm
these were laws that were extraterritorial, and that they would never be enforced. Then there were others, I think the rest of us who were working internationally and really saw what was going on the ground, that were um, we knew that this was a harbinger of what was to come, and that things would slowly but surely change.
hmm And then what was involved with the process of essentially getting businesses ready for GDPR at that point when you were working?
I think the biggest and hardest part was actually getting everyone to take notice.
Mhm.
And then the next step was getting the resources and the like money, budget, headcount, tools to actually prepare. And then the next thing was that everybody waited to the last minute. And so then it was sleep, right? Lack of sleep. You were
Mhm.
really on, trying to get everything done. Um, the other thing was to take a very, very risk-based approach, so very deliberate, very measured, and, really address the high-risk stuff first, and then work your way through the list.
Mhm. What was so you mentioned that this really started with getting making sure basically people were taking notice of this upcoming change. What did you have to do to get people to actually take this seriously or to prioritize it and take notice?
Yeah. So I was really lucky when GDPR came out. Microsoft was just so Brad Smith, I'll just say, the general counsel at the time was a visionary in this area, actually, and from the very beginning made it a differentiator. In other words, it was just integrated into everything. But obviously, after having left Microsoft, I've worked with in many other places. So Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and then I worked with Meta, and I went to NetSuite, Oracle, and now obviously I work with lots and lots of organizations as a third party. And leadership in organizations aren't necessarily as embedded as they should be in the day to day. And while at the top you usually get messages that this is important, really understanding what it takes to operationalize the laws, and GDPR, especially since it was a very first type of this law in this area for compliance, was an incredible amount of energy associated with education,
Hmm.
um, visibility, campaigning, and persuading. It just really is just a heavy lift helping leadership understand.
Do you think like where we are now that you know leadership teams of these kind of like major organizations, this there is less of that educational hurdle essentially, the good work that you did back then is now paying off.
um, it depends on if you're talking US or you're talking rest of world.
Hmm.
If you're talking in countries who are used, or even industries that are used to this type of rigor. So, for example, going to Jazz Pharmaceuticals was probably one of the best things I ever did because I went from a very unregulated industry to a very regulated industry. And as I got them ready for GDPR, when I'd walk in a room and I'd say, okay, we have to do this, 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 and this, they'd go, show me where it says that we have to do that. Show me what the regulations are. And then I'd have everything I'd need.
Hmm.
And I think it's changed. I actually think it has, but I think that in the US especially, I just think it's so new, and the ethos behind it is so foreign that it's still an uphill battle sometimes to help educate at the leadership level.
Hmm. Yeah. So you were also the deputy data protection officer at Facebook, building out their DPO program. What can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, and how did you go about building that team, and what was the scope of the work?
Yeah, that was an experience of a lifetime. That was just as Cambridge Analytica was hitting. And there had never been a DPO office at Facebook, now Meta, before.
Mhm.
So I obviously the resources were there, the funding was there. I literally pretty much had anything that I wanted or needed. And obviously I would have to educate and support my position on things, but it was just incredible. One of the things that I had to do was fill 15 heads. And in that experience, I was literally interviewing some of the best and brightest privacy professionals across the world, 2 and 3 times a week. And it
Mhm.
really helped me understand that as I was going through that process and I talked to these professionals, I would use terms of art. Like I would say, okay, so tell me what a DPIA is. Tell me what a ROPA is. And they could tell me what that was. But then when I would ask them, where would you start to operationalize that? Because remember, I was building it from the ground up. How would you start? Where would you start? Most of them had no clue how to take the law and put it into practice. It was actually quite eye opening.
Yeah, I feel like that's still a challenge today. Is bridging the gap essentially between the law and an actual action plan for businesses.
Right. Right.
So in these larger organizations that you worked in, whether that be, Facebook, now Meta, Microsoft, Apple, how does legal privacy compliance functions in those businesses typically end up working with other areas like engineering and product to actually take these things that are essentially rules and regulations, and then at some point they need to be actually implemented from an engineering perspective?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're asking a question that really highlights why privacy is such an odd area from a compliance perspective. So if you take compliance from a health data perspective, or you take compliance from a fintech or financial perspective, it's very clear. You have like internal audit, and you have people who understand the industry. You have lawyers, and there's very discrete roles. Um, in my opinion, because privacy grew up outside the United States, um, you had non-lawyers who became privacy professionals. So, for example, as a DPO, I didn't have to be a lawyer, right? Privacy professionals they don't have to be lawyers. So you have a group of people. It's almost like a bundle of sticks, right? You've
Mhm.
got all of these different roles that work together for compliance to basically make it work. And in the big tech companies that I've worked with, that has been kind of a weird thing. So, for example, internal audit feels like they own one piece, DPO feels like they own another, the lawyers feel like they own compliance, the privacy professionals on a day to day who are basically in the trenches feel like they're the ones that are supposed to be enforcing. And I think over the last several years, those roles have really started to kind of figure out what their swim lane is, and then and it's starting to kind of normalize, but it's really very different in every single organization that I have worked with and am working with today.
Mhm. And what do you think is the right mix of those, you know, matchsticks,
Yeah.
essentially?
What would I recommend? I
Yeah.
I actually think, especially since it's really hard to get that buy-in and resources. I think it depends on the company, but if you were to ask me where do I start, I basically start with three different roles. Obviously, I have a subject matter expert on the law, and then I have somebody like a DPO role that monitors, tests, advises, trains, educates, and is that advisor. And then you have your privacy professional. And those privacy professionals are, some of them are technical because, for example, they're dealing with the data. Some
Mhm.
of them are non technical because they're dealing with sales and marketing. So those privacy professionals are privacy champs are very critical to implementation.
Hey there, it's Sean, host of Partially Redacted. You probably guessed that, since at this point in the interview you probably recognize my voice. I've been told for years that I have a face for podcasting, but no one has mentioned whether I have a voice for podcasting, so sorry about that. Hopefully, the awesome guest makes up for it. Anyway, if you're enjoying this episode, please support the show by subscribing and telling your friends. You can also join Partially Redacted community at skyflow.com/community. Okay, that's enough for me. Back to the show.
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to transition a little bit to start to talk about some of the work that you're doing today. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you're the CEO and founder of Inspire Privacy and Security. Can you tell me a bit about this company? Why did you start it, and what are you actually trying to do?
Sure. So when I was deputy DPO for Facebook, I already told you my story about those realizations and light bulbs that went on. I realized that with my very, very unique background, having started as an admin at Apple, all the way up to the head of legal for Microsoft Ireland and then deputy DPO, that it had a really unique background in regard to the operationalization piece. I realized that I'd had the equivalent of about 10 MBAs. And then, so I realized I could have more impact. And I came back home to the United States and I actually started two companies because I didn't think they would work. I was scared to death. So the law firm basically still functions with big tech companies. And then Inspire was focused on small to medium businesses because I'm kind of on this jihad. The laws are being written for big tech companies, but small to medium businesses have no clue how to deal with them or operationalize them, nor do they have the resources or the tools or the contacts to understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I was really interested in having this conversation because I think so much of the what you see in the news and sort of the a lot of the thought leadership in the space of data privacy is really centered on what's happening in big tech and how it impacts them, but it also impacts a lot of other types of businesses. So, given that you're focused on small to medium sized businesses, what is like an SMB in this context? Is that,
Yeah.
when I think SMB, I think like, is that the mom and pop shop on the on the corner, or is that something that's somewhere between that and Microsoft?
So um, I have learned so much over the last 4 years. It has been trial by fire, though.
Mhm.
And what I've done is I've very deliberately designed the different clients that I've picked up. So I've been working with $5 billion cap companies all the way down to the mom and pop shops,
Mm.
and have amassed just like templates and processes and frameworks and self-help tools and training modules and other things that are designed for the CEO of a company, a very, very small company, or even just like the start, just like somebody like a 1 or 2 person company could walk in and basically say, how do I even identify the personal information I'm processing? So $5 billion cap and lower.
Yeah. So that's a pretty wide range. What is, in your experience, the difference between working with these, huge technology companies versus some of these, smaller businesses that you work with today?
Um, I think the biggest difference is that you I think the individuals responsible for privacy are more important than ever, because not only are they the senior leadership making the decisions, they're the ones that are doing the work on the day-to-day basis, and they've got to figure out how to do it all. And if they're all in, then they're really invested in making sure that this is integrated into the ways of working, the way that they work. If they're not, they fight it all the way. And I cannot tell you how many clients I've had to fire.
And then how have privacy regulations like impacted SMB market versus the big tech companies? I think we're all well aware of at least to some degree like the impact that things like GDPR and so on have had on big tech companies. But how is that actually impacting these smaller businesses?
It's so interesting because most of these small businesses, the biggest argument they have against doing what I'm recommending is we'll just fly under the radar. They only care about these big companies. We'll never get a fine. We'll never never care. And so the difference is the tools that I use to persuade and teach are different. I focus on, okay, so you may not ever talk to a regulator, but will your customer care? And will you lose deals over this, right? So you focus more on the consumer and the customer consumer or the business, even if it's B2B. And if, in fact, especially if it's B2B, because they have their own obligations
Mhm.
instead of the regulator.
Yeah, and I think that's a big shift, that like cultural shift in businesses that's happening now is sort of this moving from this old world to new world businesses where there is a subset of businesses that are using privacy not only as what they think is hopefully the right thing to do, but as an actual product differentiator and as something that has marketing power, delivers higher ROI to their business because essentially the consumer cares about that. So there's not only regulatory reasons for doing these types of things, but there's also hardcore business reasons for wanting to transform your business in this way as well.
Exactly. The other thing to focus on is that now that there's so many U.S. state laws, there you will come under that radar, right? You will get caught up in for example, a cookie sweep or something, even if you're small.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. So, what are the top 3 to 5 risks to these types of businesses when it does come to data privacy? They mentioned like the doing cookie acceptance properly, but is that like the primary one, or are there other potential risks as well?
yeah, it's interesting. When I put on my DPO hat, I always assess risk to the data subject, right? When I put on my lawyer hat or my privacy professional hat, I always assess risk to the business. And the number one risk that I raise is security breach, loss of the personal data that's being processed, and that clearly is obvious a liability. The second one would be loss of sales, loss of revenue, lost opportunity. That's the second one. The third one would be probably cost of business, right? So if you're not creating efficiencies, if you're not putting processes in place that are integrated into the way that you work, you're spending way too much money and time and resources.
Mhm. And when do you think when these businesses should be prioritizing their privacy journey? Essentially, is this something that ideally is happening from day one, or is this something that once they reach a certain stage they should be prioritizing?
Yeah, the profile of these small organizations that I've worked with is eh, very entrepreneurial, right? We've got this a great idea, we're going to start running with it. It's that organizational behavior, they start storming and then they start forming, and then they just start to sell. And unless you have somebody in that original team that really understands privacy and security, or unless they have a product or service that lends itself to that type of a liability directly, you're playing catch up whenever you bring somebody like me in.
Yeah, I see. And then we talked a little bit about how there is some educational shift that's happening in these the big tech industry in terms of understanding at least the risk to their businesses when it comes to following regulations like GDPR or other regulations around the world, and also from a data breach standpoint. But are you seeing a similar shift happening with the smaller businesses? Are they also becoming more keenly aware that this is a potential problem and risk to their business?
I would say, again, this is another, it's really important the individual that you work with. So
Hmm.
if you've got a visionary that understands regulation and making sure compliance is an important piece of their business, it's not a problem. It's not hard. It's quite easy. If you have somebody, and in fact, I'm thinking about a specific client that I've been working with for the last 4 years that I just fired. Um, some of them you just never convince, and they fight you the whole way. So.
What's your typical engagement with these companies? Like, what's the service you're usually providing them and helping them accomplish?
So I always had a plan for a one-to-many model, but for the last 4 years, I've been in research mode. And so I literally have been the product and then had privacy professionals that I've trained and taught. And so I come in and I'm a consulting house right now. I'm about to release an app that basically takes the framework and all the tools that I've created and puts them in a self-help mode. And then I also have a book coming out. I'm starting with the DPO focus first, but then we'll move to the other roles.
Oh, fantastic. Well, maybe when the book comes out, we'll have to have you back. So, in terms of the app and the framework that you mentioned, you had shared some details with me previously about this comprehensive framework that you've created. Can you dive into the details a little bit about that? Like, how did you build it, and how does it actually help a company, and what are your sort of goals for this self serve application?
Sure. So, one of my primary responsibilities in all of the big tech companies that I've had, especially since I started out as kind of the doer, is to basically build global programs. So I literally took that muscle and I went out to all the major privacy and security laws, and started to say, this provision by provision, these are the tasks that need to be done. Then I organized them in pillars, and there's 13 of them. And in each pillar, I would kind of create a module. And as I worked through with each of the clients, they would ask me questions, right? So it was real time development. So my first pillar is always governance, because if there's no leadership, there's nothing. And the first task is always assign somebody to be responsible for privacy. And so they'd always say, well, what does that look like? And so I've got job descriptions, I've got process flows, I've got a training module on what is governance and what would this person be doing. And and it's all been taken on real-time delivery. So this framework's very different from anything like is usually being used, like OneTrust or TrustArc or anything like that. It literally is like me coming in and saying, here's your first task, here's what you need to do, and go do it.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's moving beyond just compliance as a checklist, but actually helping someone potentially build out their own privacy program from scratch, as well as distill the law into operations or action plans that they can take as a business.
That's right. That's right.
So, what are what's next for this application that you've been working on? What do you have
So
for plans for that?
so I'm a lawyer. That's
Mhm.
me. And I am to this point where I've never done any of these things. So I need a coach, kind of like other people need me for privacy. So
Mhm.
I've actually hired some coaches and some teams, and we're planning on a soft launch in April. And you will, like, for example, see the book out on Amazon. You'll see me, doing a whole lot on LinkedIn, and we'll see how it goes.
Awesome, that's great. And then, kind of looking towards the future beyond your own experience in the company that you've been building, but where do you see the world of like privacy regulations and privacy considerations for businesses going in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So I was expecting two. So let me do two first, and then we'll go
Okay.
5 to 10. I would say as soon as 2 years from now, everybody, especially in the United States, is going to care. Whether there's a federal law or not. And in fact, heaven help us if there's not a federal law, because I lived in the world where I had to deal in the EU with 28 regulators and 50 states plus territories is going to be a nightmare. In 5 years, I think you'll start to see it normalize. I think it will be an everyday thing that needs to occur in businesses, and not even just businesses. I think you'll start to see the rest of world ethos creep into the culture. Um, the other thing that's starting to happen is, and I hope this really shifts, is you've got so many high visibility breaches that individuals are starting to become activists associated with this. And we need to get back to the place where there's a level of trust on both sides. And I'm hoping that that's where we are in 10 years. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think consumer demand for this on essentially increased responsibility on the business side is is really what is going to be a huge motivator for businesses, because if you're not part of this new world order where privacy is a differentiator and part of who you are as a business, you're going to just get left behind essentially because consumers aren't going to put up with it.
yeah, they won't buy from you. They just
Yeah.
they just won't.
Mhm. And then, do you think that dealing essentially with the challenges around data privacy, the rules and regulations for companies will get easier, and what needs to happen to essentially help us get there?
So I worked in business for a really long time, and I think that obviously there's a cycle, and I've taught organizational behavior and other things, and we are in that forming stage, right? And
Mhm.
companies like Skyflow, companies like mine, and in fact, it really started like with OneTrust and TrustArc, right, where they really started to try and take all of this and put it in a digestible format. It will start to normalize. It will start to be part of the everyday, and there will start to be standards that are expected at every level, that people will start to understand in a plain language way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess when it becomes part of just an understanding, then it also gets easier for businesses because essentially it automatically kind of shifts everything left. You're not reactively dealing with these problems. You're doing it from day one. So it's just kind of easier to bake into the culture of the business when you realize you need to do those things up front.
Yeah, well, I mean, even think about mergers and acquisitions, right? The due
Mhm.
diligence associated with security is quite sophisticated actually because of all of the breaches. So privacy will become the same way when you get into those situations. What have you been doing around privacy? What does that look like? What's our liability and exposure? It'll be quantified,
Hmm.
and the information provided will be qualitative as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point. So as we start to wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share?
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I don't often tell my story in a broad level or a broad way. I tell it on a one-to-one basis. So this is really a great opportunity, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. I think we covered a lot of ground, but in a lot of ways, we only scratched the surface. I think of your background. It'd be great to have you back down the road. Maybe after the book comes out. I'm sure there's lots of other
Sure.
things that we can get into the details on. But thanks again, and cheers.
All right, Sean. Thanks. Take care.